Sands of Exclusion. Chapter 1. Sandy Expanse. The desert stretched out before him like an endless sea, silent and treacherous. Mark Felton trudged through the sands, feeling his boots sink into the scorching dunes. Around him, there was not a soul in sight, only the quiet hiss of the wind carrying with it grains of salt and sand that seemed to gnaw at his skin. The sky, covered in a murky haze, revealed a pale and cold sun, barely illuminating his path. 2 years had passed since Mark had crossed the boundary of the Exclusion Zone. He had come here on a mission that many considered suicidal, to study and understand the nature of the anomalies that turned this territory into a deadly trap. Once, he had been a successful scientist, but personal tragedies and losses had driven him to this isolated edge of the world, where every day was a struggle for survival. Only here, among the dead lands, did Mark find solace in his research. He meticulously studied every detail, collected samples, and recorded data, all in an effort to uncover the secrets that this land had concealed for decades. But even after 2 years, his searches had yielded no answers. Every new discovery only raised more questions, and sometimes Mark wondered if these pursuits would lead to his demise. His research had caught the attention of local gangs that ruled the zone. They saw Mark not just as a scientist, but as a threat to their existence. In a world where power decided everything, Mark's knowledge could be a dangerous weapon, capable of shifting the balance of power. Thus, his presence here was a constant balancing act. He tried not to draw too much attention to himself, yet also not to remain in the shadows. This tension was especially palpable in recent months, when Mark began to encounter a gang known as the Wanderers more frequently. This group of survivors, led by a ruthless leader, controlled significant territories within the zone, and any attempt to explore their lands could end in bloodshed. Mark knew he had to be cautious, but his curiosity and drive to learn often outweighed his caution. One morning, while Mark was collecting data from one of his sensors, he heard a noise coming from behind a nearby dune. He strained his ears, listening intently. It was the sound of footsteps. Several people were approaching, and their intentions were clearly hostile. Mark quickly packed up his equipment and hid behind a boulder, watching to see what would happen next. A group of people in tattered clothing, armed with primitive weapons and firearms, appeared on the horizon. Mark immediately recognized them. They were members of the Wanderers. They seemed to be searching for someone or something, and Mark knew it was best not to be seen by them. He understood that an encounter with them could end badly, especially if they discovered his research. He remained motionless, trying not to make a sound as the gang passed by, but his heart pounded in his chest, as if sensing that this encounter was just the beginning of something much larger. Mark realized that his presence in the zone would no longer go unnoticed. Chapter 2. Laila. A few days had passed since Mark narrowly avoided an encounter with the Wanderers. He continued his research, but his thoughts kept returning to that meeting. Something about it left him uneasy. One figure in particular stuck in his mind, a girl with long, dark hair who walked behind the others, as if she didn't belong to the group, but was still with them. One evening, as Mark was returning to his temporary camp, he noticed movement in the shadows of a ruined building. His heart skipped a beat, and he cautiously approached, trying to see who it was. But before he could take another step, the girl from his memories stepped into the light. She was alone. "Are you following me?" she asked without looking directly at him, but her voice was filled with distrust. Mark raised his hands, showing that he meant no harm. "No," he replied calmly. "I'm just returning from my research." Her gaze was tense, but at the same time, there was something in it that told Mark she wasn't planning to attack him. "Why are you here?" Her voice was firm, but there was a note of curiosity in it. "I'm a scientist," Mark answered. "I study the anomalies of the zone. I'm trying to understand what's happening here and why." She studied him closely, and Mark noticed how her expression softened when she heard his words. This surprised him. Usually, people in the zone reacted to the mention of science with distrust or mockery, but not her. "My name is Laila," she finally introduced herself. "And you'd better stay away from my group if you want to stay alive." Mark nodded, understanding that his life indeed hung by a thread. "I understand. But why are you here alone?" Laila hesitated for a moment, as if she wasn't sure whether to answer him. But then she looked him straight in the eye and said, "Sometimes I need to be alone, far from them, from this world." Mark didn't know how to respond. He felt that there was something in her that made her special, different from the other gang members. Her words, her gaze, all of it spoke of an inner conflict she was trying to hide. This intrigued him, and he decided that he wanted to know her better. "If you don't mind, maybe I can help you?" he offered, knowing that he was taking a risk. Laila thought for a moment, then nodded. "Maybe," she replied quietly, "but not here and not now. Meet me tomorrow at the old bridge. It'll be safer there." She turned and quickly disappeared into the darkness, leaving Mark alone. But this time, he felt different. For the first time in a long while, he felt his heart start to beat faster, not from fear, but from anticipation. Laila had awakened something in him that he had long thought lost. Chapter 3. Immersing in Danger. The next day, Mark made his way to the old bridge that Laila had mentioned during their last meeting. The bridge had long been abandoned and was half buried in sand, making it an ideal place for secret meetings. The silence around him was almost eerie, broken only by the sound of the wind sweeping through the desolate landscape. As Mark approached the bridge, he saw Laila standing on the ruins, gazing into the distance as if lost in thought. He didn't rush, allowing her time to sense his presence. Eventually, she turned and met his gaze. "You came," she said, her voice carrying a warm note. "Of course," Mark replied, stepping closer. "You said it would be safe here." Laila smiled, but there was a sadness in her smile. "There's no real safety in this world," she said quietly. "But here, at least for a moment, we can forget about everything else." Mark nodded, understanding her words. He felt that emptiness, that constant danger surrounding them at every turn. But near Laila, he felt something different, a warmth that rekindled the dim flame of life within him. "Why did you choose me?" he finally asked, deciding it was time to stop hiding behind polite words. Laila sighed and looked at him with unexpected seriousness. "Because you're not like them," she said, nodding toward where the camp of the Wanderers was located. "You're not cruel, not bitter at the world. You've kept something human. I see it in you." Her words touched Mark deeply. He rarely heard such things about himself, especially in recent times. He looked at Laila and felt that something special was developing between them, something they both couldn't fully understand, but could no longer deny. "No matter what happens next," Mark said softly, "I don't want to lose this. I don't want to lose you." Laila silently looked at him, and tears shimmered in her eyes, tears she tried to hide. She stepped closer, and Mark felt her warmth, her fears and doubts. Their lips met in a tender but deep kiss, full of promises and hopes. But in their world, there was no place for simple joys. In every moment of happiness, a threat was hidden, and Mark knew that this love could become their downfall. But he was willing to risk everything for her, even his life. Chapter 4. The Zone's Influence. Several weeks had passed since Mark and Laila's relationship had grown closer. Mark tried to avoid open conflicts with the Wanderers, but his research and newfound connection with Laila made it increasingly difficult. He knew that sooner or later, someone would notice their frequent meetings, and that could lead to irreversible consequences. During one of their expeditions, Mark and Laila stumbled upon an anomaly that emitted a strange glow. Mark had never seen anything like it before, and decided he had to study it more closely. Laila, though not sharing his scientific curiosity, didn't stop him, leaving him alone with the object of his study. As Mark immersed himself in his research, Laila felt a growing sense of unease. Her instincts told her they needed to leave as soon as possible. But before she could call out to Mark, several mutants, drawn by the strange glow, rushed out from behind the nearest hill. Laila managed to shoot one of them, but the others charged at her with terrifying speed. Mark, hearing the gunshots, turned and saw Laila fighting off the creatures. He ran to her, but he was too late. One of the beasts managed to wound her before he could finish it off. Everything happened in seconds, but those seconds changed their lives forever. Laila collapsed to the ground, and Mark rushed to her side, trying to stop the bleeding. He could feel her body trembling, and realized that the wound might be fatal. "It's going to be okay," he whispered, trying to convince not just her, but also himself. "We'll get out of here. I'll find help." Laila, barely holding on to consciousness, nodded weakly, but her gaze was already growing dim. Mark knew they needed to get back to camp as quickly as possible, but somewhere deep inside, he understood that something had gone terribly wrong. Chapter 5. Metamorphosis. A few days later, Laila began to change. At first, it was subtle. Paler skin, increased sensitivity to light. Strange dreams that tormented her at night. Mark tried to find an explanation, but everything he discovered only intensified his fears. It seemed that the zone had taken hold of Laila. She became more withdrawn. Her body continued to change, and Mark realized that their time together was running out. He conducted every possible test, desperately searching for a way to halt the process, but all his efforts were in vain. Laila, seeing his suffering, tried not to show how much pain she was in. She wanted their last days together to be filled with love and warmth, not with fear and despair. But it became increasingly difficult, especially as her body began to change shape, becoming less and less human. One night, when Laila couldn't sleep, Mark sat beside her and took her hand. "You have to let me go," she said quietly, her voice filled with sadness but also determination. "I don't want you to see me like this." Mark squeezed her hand tighter, his eyes filling with tears. "I can't, Laila," he whispered. "I can't let you go." Laila looked at him and smiled, despite all the pain she was feeling. "Then don't," she replied, pulling him closer. "But remember that I'll always be with you, no matter what happens." They spent the night together, recalling the best moments of their short but passionate love. Mark knew that these would be his last precious memories, ones he would cherish for the rest of his life. Chapter 6: The Last Kiss. On their final night together, Laila could barely move. Her body had almost completely transformed, and Mark knew that soon she would become one of those monsters they had fought together. He sat beside her, holding her, feeling her breathing grow weaker with each passing moment. As the first ray of sunlight broke through the grim sky, Laila whispered softly, "Mark, I love you. Thank you for being with me." He looked into her eyes, which still held a flicker of humanity, and felt his heart shatter into pieces. He knew what he had to do, but it was the hardest decision of his life. Tears streamed down his face as he leaned in and kissed her for the last time. Her breath slowed and finally ceased, and Mark knew she was gone. All that remained was the shell of her body, soon to turn into a creature. With a heavy heart, he took the knife and did what he knew had to be done. It was a cruel but necessary act to free her from suffering. Mark understood that after this, his life would never be the same. When it was over, he closed her eyes and sat beside her for the rest of the day, just feeling her presence, trying to hold on to every moment they had shared. Chapter 7: Returning Home. 14 months had passed since Mark left the zone. He had returned to America, but his soul remained there, among the sands and anomalies. He was broken, but not completely defeated. Laila had taught him to love, even when the world around him was falling apart. Now he lived alone, trying to find new meaning in life. Sometimes, it seemed to him that he could hear her voice, see her face in his dreams, and this brought him both pain and comfort. But he knew that he had to keep going, despite everything that had happened. Mark began writing a book about his research in the zone, hoping that his experience would help others understand this world and perhaps avoid his mistakes. But deep down, he knew that the real reason he was writing was to preserve the memory of Laila, of the love they shared, and of how that love had changed his life forever. The end. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to our channel and don't forget to hit the like button. Thank you for your attention.